From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
And there will be question and answer, as well as sales and book signing right after Jonathan concludes. So, Jonathan Lyons holds a doctorate in sociology and is taught at George Mason University, Georgetown University, and Monash University in Australia. For more than 20 years, he was an editor and foreign correspondent for Reuters. He is the author of The House of Wisdom, How the Arabs Transformed Western Civilization, and today he'll join us to talk about his newest book, also from the Bloomsbury Press, The Society for Useful Knowledge, How Benjamin Franklin and Friends Brought the Enlightenment to America. Jonathan?
Thank you, Steve, for those kind words. It's really great to be back here at the Library of Congress. It was here that I researched and wrote the Society for Useful Knowledge, and in fact, the greater part of 3 earlier books as well. So I feel like I'm back among old friends. Before I talk about the book in substance, I want to just tell you a little bit about how I came to write it. It's always a point of interest when I do book talks, and I'm happy to address it. I was reading something totally unrelated to American history. It was a footnote, in fact, and yes, I'm one of those readers who read footnotes. I'm also one of those writers who like to write lots of footnotes. I'm not so interested in citations, but what I like about footnotes, it tells me that another author has decided that this point is interesting but tangential to his or her project, and I figure, well, it might be useful for my project, and I'm trying to find some new ideas, and so footnotes are actually a very good source. This particular footnote discussed the teaching of Arabic in 18th and 19th century England by so-called useful knowledge societies, and I was so taken with the notion that there could be a useful knowledge society that I started to poke around. But instead of working in England, I wanted to see how this idea had transformed and had it been adopted and how it had been transformed in America. And so I started researching that. And it seems that everywhere I turned, I ran into the figure of Benjamin Franklin. Now, there are many Franklins. And if you look through library catalogs, you'll see there are an enormous number of books about Franklin. But I think I found my own Franklin, sort of the social intellectual entrepreneur. And so Franklin forms the frame for a book that's really about the intellectual history of colonial America and how we became a technological power. So this book, The Society for Useful Knowledge, explores the roots of early American technology and science, forces that steadily transformed the country first into an industrial superpower and only then into a geopolitical one. Accounts of such inventions are the stuff of American legend. We often hear the phrase, only in America, as in, only in America could 2 bicycle mechanics build the first successful airplane and launch an aviation industry. Only in America could a self-taught engineer invent the light bulb and found the first industrial research lab, Thomas Edison, of course. And only in America could a pair of college dropouts create the Apple computer. I'm referring, of course, to Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. And we could add many others, Henry Ford, Bill Gates, and so on. Now, all of these figures share a number of key traits. They were largely or wholly self-taught. That is, they were not products of formal education. As a result, they had freed themselves from the constraints of conventional wisdom and traditional authority. They preferred practical solutions to theoretical discussion. They were, in essence, engineers, not mathematicians. In other words, they were supreme practitioners of what I call useful knowledge. Now, attempts to explain America's technological prowess generally revolve around the notion that its political and social system provided an ideal platform, some would say the ideal platform, for innovation and for the associated economic growth, prosperity, and the general pursuit of happiness. In this view, it was the new republic shaped by the founding fathers that set the stage for the technological explosion of the 19th and 20th centuries, one that continues to this day. In this view, key components of our success would include the creation of liberal democracy, our laissez-faire approach to capitalism, and the passage of strong patent laws and other protection for intellectual property. Yet this is what I would call a history of the present. That is, it's a misreading of historical development derived by working backwards from today's America. My overarching purpose in writing the Society for Useful Knowledge is to propose a very different reading of American history. And as I show in my book, and as I can only outline for you today, the American Revolution represents less a turning point than a significant milestone in a journey that began not at Lexington and Concord in spring of 1775, but in the study circles, public libraries, and the useful knowledge societies that first took shape in colonial cities and towns almost 50 years earlier. Long before the Boston Tea Party or other overt acts of defiance to imperial rule, American practitioners of useful knowledge and the institutions that they developed successfully challenged the social, political, and intellectual order of the day. The accompanying knowledge revolution, epitomized by Franklin and his circle, beginning in the mid-1720s, freed the colonists of constraints imported and imposed from Europe. This then laid the groundwork for American independence. The central actors in my story are not the founding fathers per se, although a number of them make cameo appearances, and the towering figure of Franklin straddles both the political and scientific worlds. Rather, my focus is on the earlier cohort of artisans, craftsmen, and independent farmers, captivated by two central ideas borrowed from the European Enlightenment and then shaped by the American experience. One, that the value of learning and knowledge, of information and data, is directly proportional to its practical import or utility. In other words, to be of any real value, knowledge has to be truly useful. And two, that anyone, not just the high-born or well-educated or wealthy, could take part in the pursuit of science and knowledge in general. So the fact that we were talking about a social movement that was not just limited to the educated and economic elite reflected demands for reform of education, a challenge to the ruling elite and their role in educational policy, in particular, a challenge to the notion that learning had to be done in Latin or Greek. Of course, this was a great disadvantage for poor people and middle-class people who couldn't spend 5 years learning Latin and Greek, so they could then study science, history, and philosophy. At one point, Franklin asks in a letter to a young woman whom he's tutoring, quote, "What signifies philosophy that does not apply to some use?" Of course, these ideas had to be adapted to the conditions and circumstances of colonial America. Now, the Puritans and Quakers and other religious dissidents and sectaries had very different ideas of knowledge than perhaps the London elite. America also suffered from a lack of capital, shortage of libraries and real universities. We had a small population, a large landmass, and long lines of communication. And then more broadly, America, and even the term America in European usage at the time, was seen as virgin territory that could be remade into something else. It was a plastic idea, if you will, and therefore subject to invention, to modification, and even to the notion of perfection. If the American rebellion was at heart a knowledge revolution, then who were the revolutionaries? Well, let's take a look at some of the leading figures in the early American movement for useful knowledge, all of whom appear as important characters in my book. We'll be speaking a lot today about Benjamin Franklin and later about his secret club, the Junta. There's the farmer and botanist John Bartram. He was a Quaker, a farmer. He lived just outside Pennsylvania. The glazier and mathematician Thomas Godfrey. Godfrey invented an improved method, quadrant, a device for navigation. Became very important to seaborne communications. Ebenezer Kinnersley was a Baptist minister who fell out with his fellow religious figures and was out of work. Franklin adopted him as one of his circle and even wrote lectures. Franklin would write the text of lectures. Lecturing was important to colonial science and knowledge. People were not generally reading widely or attending university, and so people would go to public lectures where someone would present the latest understanding of electricity, for example, and there would be demonstrations, static electricity, making your hair stand on end, and doing other experiments. And of course, the instrument maker, David Rittenhouse. Now, I put the dates of their births and deaths on purpose because I want you to note the degree to which they had either died or had spent their most fruitful years before the outbreak of the American Revolution, and certainly before, with the exception of Franklin and Rittenhouse, before the creation of the federal United States. What is also notable about these figures, and many of the others around them, were their social origins. Most were drawn from among the urban craftsmen or artisans rather than from the ranks of gentlemen who typically held sway in colonial towns and cities. Collectively, they were known as mechanics, and they came together not only to pursue science and knowledge in general, but also to advance their own social, economic, and political interests. Now, at the time, contemporary English usage defined the mechanic as, quote, a practitioner of those arts wherein the hand and the body are more concerned than the mind. And in England, the term carried with it a residual class prejudice. However, things were very different here in the New World. The shortage of skilled labor in colonial America, the accompanying high wages, and the lack of restrictive regulations — there were no guild regulations, for example — meant that many a master craftsman or a mechanic could aspire to become an independent entrepreneur with considerable economic security, social standing, and political influence. They could also take advantage that the Quakers in particular, the Puritans as well, really put a value on labor, on working honestly with your hands. And so they valued the laborer, the work of the craftsman, in a way that wasn't always as evident in a more hierarchical society back in the mother country. Even the journeyman then could hope to save enough funds to buy land and become an independent farmer, or to go into business for himself. So Franklin writes, hence it is that artisans generally live better and more easily in America than in Europe, and such as are good economists make a comfortable provision for age and for their children. So in 1727, Franklin and 11 others, mostly mechanics, formed what was called the Leather Apron Club, known more commonly as the Junta. Now, the leather apron was the badge of the craftsman, the silversmith, the clockmaker. They would wear leather aprons. And so they wore this as a badge of honor. And I'm going to read briefly a description from my book of the early Junta. Franklin's group, so known simply as the Junta, combined the conviviality of a private drinking club with the advantages of a mutual aid society, the moral and intellectual self-improvement of a discussion circle, and the altruism of a civic association. Membership was restricted to 12, and proceedings were conducted in secret, all the better to advance the participants' projects, facilitate planning, and pursue career advancement. It also protected the Junta, argued Franklin, who was, by the way, the biggest exponent of secrecy, from awkward solicitation for membership from friends and associates. Gatherings of the Junta were held at the Indian King Tavern on Market Street. This is in Philadelphia, of course, one of the oldest of the drinking establishments that were integral to the city's civic life. Here, out-of-town visitors could find lodging, and locals could hold meetings, attend concerts, or sample the latest news and gossip. The Masonic Lodge, another Franklin project, later held some of its earliest meetings at the Indian King, and the final order to evacuate American forces and leave the town to the advancing British in September of 1777 was issued from the bar. But for now, the Junta met each week at the Indian Head to discuss personal and professional advancement, as well as the prevailing idiom of science, or so-called natural philosophy, and the language of social improvement. Franklin writes, quote, the rules that I drew up required that every member, in his turn, should produce one or more queries on any point of morals, politics, or natural philosophy to be discussed by the company. In addition, each participant was expected to deliver an original paper once every 3 months. Franklin was very much the driving force, and he, as well as by far the longest living member, and he drew up what he called queries for the Junta. Each member was supposed to read these to himself the morning before that night's session and prepare. You can see from the text I put up the nature of questions that most concern Franklin and his colleagues. I would point out a very social notion of knowledge, of practical solution, and a broad curiosity about the outside world. Now, they were, of course, meeting in a tavern, and so Franklin made sure that they had time to, quote, pause while one might fill and drink a glass of wine. In the summer months, the members gathered for calisthenics, and they even had their own club song, which Franklin directed should be, quote, hummed in consort by as many as can hum it. Now, over time, the junta emerged as a driving force in the civic life of Philadelphia, and its project focused primarily on the needs of fellow mechanics and on practical solutions to economic and social problems facing this new class of Americans. To give you some idea of the range and scope of their interests, paper currency. Franklin had just, with the help of some of the junta members, acquired a press. And so they had their own propaganda wing, as it were. And he wrote an essay, together with his friends in the junta, supporting the creation of emission of paper currency in the province. Pennsylvania suffered very badly, as did many colonies, from a shortage of metal coinage. This was a real problem for the lower and middle classes. It was fine for the rich, who were generally creditors, but craftsmen, silversmiths in particular, but printers often had to go into debt to buy supplies to keep their business going, and there was a shortage of currency with which to repay their debts. Now, the rich, the powerful, of course, were concerned about inflation. They argued that paper money would create inflation and would reduce the value of their interest payments. So it was a real class struggle. Franklin and the junta wrote a very powerful essay on the issue of paper currency, and largely through their lobbying, the Pennsylvania Assembly did pass a law to create a paper currency, and in gratitude to Franklin, they gave him the contract to print it. A good example of self-improvement at work. The junta, Philadelphia, of course, was quite a growing city. Most of the houses were made of wood. Fire, particularly, we're still in the days before the lightning rod. We'll get to that later. So fire brigades and fire insurance were an innovation that they put together. There's a lovely picture in the book I can show you later, or you can look at it after I'm done, of a young Franklin in a fireman's suit with a fireman's hat. They developed ways to improve street cleaning. Franklin tweaked the city light, the design of the city lighting, and improved it greatly. The Franklin stove, the relatively high efficiency stove, grew out of junta discussions on two issues: the high cost of firewood and the fact that all their houses were really smoky. And so they came up with a design. Of course, we're in the Library of Congress, but really one of the great, if not the great early libraries in America was the Library Company of Philadelphia. Now, the junta members wanted originally just to pool their books, but they found, A, there were only 12 of them, B, they had all the same books. Everyone had John Locke, but nobody had, Desaugiers' book on scientific method, for example. So they decided that wasn't going to work, and they formed a subscription library, which laid the foundation for one of the greatest public library systems in the country. And then finally, they helped develop and fund and build an early college and academy, which eventually became the future University of Pennsylvania. Now, what was interesting in particular about the development of the University of Pennsylvania, and this is one of the rare instances that we know that Franklin failed to achieve his goal and admitted his failure. His notion was that this should be a college and university aimed at mechanics. In other words, it should be practical, it should be attainable, it should be affordable, and very definitely it should not be taught in Latin and Greek. His argument was, why take 5 years to master the classical languages just to use them as a medium of instruction? The elite of Philadelphia, which dominated the board of the early college and eventually the board of the University of Pennsylvania, very much disagreed. They wanted their sons, as it was at the time, to have a gentleman's education on par with what they would have in England. And so they rolled back the curriculum of the so-called English school. And to his very last days, Franklin was extremely bitter about this. And in his last years, he spent a lot of time going through the original minutes 30 years back of the planning and development of the curriculum to try to show that the trustees had sold out the original vision And it had been that vision which had attracted the mechanics to give money and labor to create it. And so he felt that they had really done a disservice. Now, the junta and its offshoots, with Franklin often center stage, laid the groundwork for the creation of useful knowledge societies across the colonies, including what would one day become the American Philosophical Society, the nation's most venerable such association, and one that thrives to this day. And in fact, I'll be speaking there. Knowledge societies move slowly, so I have a date. However, it is in March of 2014. However, I'm still thrilled to go. So knowledge societies. The 18th century was, I think, very much an age of the learned society. The Royal Society of London, for the improvement of natural knowledge, to give you its full name, was the primary model for the Americans. And I mentioned the Quaker farmer and botanist John Bartram, who together with Franklin first proposed an American society in 1743. But the idea really went nowhere and largely lay dormant for almost 2 decades before it finally sort of took hold and began to bear fruit. This example set by Philadelphia, which all the same developed a lively intellectual scene, spurred a number of imitators. Eventually, the movement for useful knowledge would take hold in where we are today, Washington, the new capital, Trenton, New Jersey, Albany, New York, Alexandria, Virginia, and as far south as Carolina and Mississippi, and as far west as Kentucky. And more specialized knowledge associations, those devoted to manufacturing, improvements in agriculture, the study of natural history, and even a short-lived military philosophy society at West Point also appeared. Now, these groups were invariably local or regional in scope. And it's very interesting, if you look at the names, they always identified their association with a very specific city or region. So we have the Society for Useful Knowledge in the province of New York, or we have the Military Society of Albany, or we have the Manufacturing Society of Trenton. Why was this? Well, the 18th century idea of knowledge and the exchange of knowledge was very much a face-to-face personal experience. These groups had to be small enough and intimate enough to allow for regular gatherings of its members. They could hear lectures, reports, and discuss matters of mutual interest. So the pursuit of knowledge in this way of thinking was personal, but at the same time provided a broad cross-section of local society, so other people who were perhaps not members could still attend some of the functions, and gave them direct access to useful knowledge. When that proved impossible, then, a highly organized system of correspondence, generally coordinated by a secretary or other functionary, filled in the gaps. And one of the reasons that Franklin, who's famous as being postmaster, wanted to be postmaster of Philadelphia and then eventually postmaster of the newly independent states was to facilitate the exchange of scientific ideas. Because in those days, the recipient had to pay postage, and postage was extremely expensive. But Franklin, as postmaster, had franking privileges, as it were, and could send things for free. So if you just sent it to Franklin, he would then distribute it widely and save everybody a lot of money. Was a penny saved is a penny earned, right? One of the greatest obstacles facing these early American efforts was entrenched European prejudice against colonial science. It was widely accepted at the time that the colonies could act merely as suppliers of raw materials. These would be seeds of local plants, narrative accounts of strange diseases, the bones of unknown animals, and so on. And these were for study, classification, and explanation by natural philosophers back in the mother country. This information would then be sent back as science. So in this way, the scientific knowledge followed the same pathway as the trade in basic commodities and their subsequent transformation into high-value finished goods for sale back to the colonies. So for example, you colonies send us iron ore, we'll send you finished steel products and you pay us a lot of money. That wasn't, of course, the essence of the mercantilist system. The point I want to emphasize is that the knowledge economy tracked that almost exactly. John Bartram, one of the more interesting figures that I profile in the book, his career really illustrates this phenomenon of colonial science as subsidiary to the grand project of real science. And it provides a valuable context for understanding just what a breakthrough Franklin and his colleagues eventually achieved. Now, Bartram was a taciturn farmer. He lived on a remote property, as I said, outside Philadelphia, but he was gradually drawn into the city's intellectual life by members of the junta, and he became an active collector on behalf of the Royal Society, the famous Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus, and even at one point the British court. The London merchant Peter Collinson, he was also a member of the Royal Society, served as Bartram's main contact with European science. At his direction, Bartram traveled widely, often abandoning his farming duties for weeks at a time to fulfill Collinson's seemingly endless requests for more specimens. I'm going to read briefly from a description of this relationship. By all accounts, Bartram bore up remarkably well under these exacting demands, ranging far and wide and enduring numerous hardships in the wilderness to fulfill his missions. On an expedition to the Cedar Swamp in New Jersey to collect pine cones for the Duke of Norfolk, Bartram struggled against the elements. He writes, "I climbed the tree in the rain, lopped off the boughs, and then must stand up to the knees in snow to pluck off the cones." On another trip, Bartram devoted 2 weeks of, quote, painstaking effort, close quote, to tracking down the rare willow-leafed oak, only to have most of its treasured acorns devoured by squirrels and hogs. No request, it seems, was too demanding or too daunting. The American furnished muskrat skins, a hornet's nest, samples of native ginseng for a proposed export scheme to China, and even live turtle eggs that Collinson received just in time to see one hatch. For the most part, Collinson and his colleagues were not particularly interested in what Bartram might think or what first-hand experience might tell him, but only in what he could collect and then send back to Europe for their study and analysis. In fact, Collinson openly discouraged the American from engaging in scientific speculation. He writes, quote, "The box of seeds came very safe and in good order," he reported in one letter. "Thy remarks on them are very curious, but I think take up too much of thy time and thought. I would not make my correspondence burdensome, but must desire thee to continue the same collections over again." Throughout their lengthy correspondence, Collinson is explicit that it is only the opinions of experts back in Europe that carry any weight, and he dismisses Bartram's own views on the existence of two separate varieties of American cedar, the white and the red. This was a running controversy. Were they actually different species? So he dismissed his own conjectures until details of the plants could be examined by the natural philosophers of London, Oxford, Berlin, or Uppsala. Quote, "Half a dozen by way of specimen will be sufficient, for though you call it white cedar, we are in doubt what class it belongs to until we see the seed vessels." Now, Collinson regularly forwarded some of Bartram's samples to his expert colleagues who assigned them Latin names in accordance with the latest thinking on plant classification, and then returned these rulings to Bartram for his edification. "Send more seed," Collinson requested in a letter of March 14, 1736. "All the specimens went to Oxford. When they are sent back with their names, thee shall hear from me." So by contrast, let's look at doing American science. Franklin and his colleagues, the so-called Philadelphia electricians, so a circle that was engaged in electrical experimentation, forced the Europeans to make room for American science. Let's look at what they did. Well, they finally found a very practical, one could say useful way, to confirm the identity of electricity and lightning. Now, there's widespread speculation at the time in Europe that lightning and electricity were one and the same, but no one had really figured out a way to demonstrate this. We all know about the kite experiment. There were other methods as well, a previous one. Franklin was not actually, as it happens, the first one to carry out his own experiment. It was carried out in France and replicated in Russia. But he quickly got word and was not particularly surprised to find that they had been able to demonstrate the identity of lightning and electricity. He came up with what I would call a plausible explanation. It turns out not to be an explanation we would accept today, but a plausible explanation of the Leyden jar, which was a capacitor built out of a large jar filled with iron shot and water, basically a store of electricity. He invented the battery by stringing together a series, and he came up with the name battery by stringing together a series of Leyden jars. He and his colleagues distinguished and recognized the difference between negative and positive electrical charges. And of course, all this set the stage for the lightning rod. In 1753, the Royal Society awarded Franklin its highest honor, the Copley Medal. Now, the Royal Society was then the leading scientific society in the world, so this was kind of like a Nobel Prize for science. Unlike Bartram and the other North American naturalists whose works could be absorbed seamlessly into existing European conceptions of plant and animal life, Franklin and his fellow electricians presented a true achievement in basic science, one that featured a revolutionary theory to explain observations derived from experimentation. The adulation of the Royal Society marked a quick reversal of fortune for Franklin and for colonial science. The initial reception toward the work of the Philadelphia electricians had been dismissive, a fact that still rankled Franklin many decades later, while their subsequent findings were, Franklin wrote, quote, laughed at by the connoisseurs. The leading French expert in electricity, Jean-Antoine Nollet, whose own theories were seriously undermined by Franklin's approach, refused to believe his eyes. Overwhelmed by the absurdity of an American scientist, Nollet confided to an ally that this so-called Benjamin Franklin guy was surely a fictitious creature created by his own jealous rivals in England. And yet, the popular acclaim for Franklin for the notion of electricity, and particularly for taming the very real danger of lightning, is wonderfully captured in this portrait by Benjamin West, Franklin Among the Gods. Now, Franklin also excelled at the art of scientific correspondence, that is, the elaborate and coordinated exchange of information with colleagues across Europe and throughout the colonies, what we today would call social networking. Over time, he established himself as the chief representative of American science, and all significant flows of information about science, discoveries, and inventions eventually started flowing through his hands. In my darker moments or lighter moments, I can almost see Franklin tweeting about or blogging about the latest inventions. This helped solidify his position and prestige and enabled him to spread his ideas and influence around the world. It also redounded to the benefit of the cause of American rebellion against the British, because Franklin's standing and prestige as a scientist made him a formidable diplomat and advocate of the American cause. Here I have a lovely picture from a Japanese woodcut of, I mentioned there were two methods that Franklin came up with. This is what's known as the sentry box method. That's a lightning rod on top of this structure with a chain running down. It should be into the ground. This is one method. This dates from about I'm not sure, do I have the date? Yeah, 1865, but it is a historical recreation or image of Japanese attempts, and successful attempts, by the way, to carry out the very same or very similar experiments. So if the Philadelphia electricians put colonial science on the map, then American contributions to a pair of astronomical observations made sure that they stayed there. Astronomers knew that in 1761 and 1769, the planet Venus would be seen to traverse the face of the sun, a rare but recurrent phenomenon that could be then used to establish the absolute size of the universe. For the newly amalgamated American Philosophy Society, what had happened is Franklin had proposed this in 1743. It really hadn't done much. Then little groups kind of surfaced and tried to revive the idea. Two rival groups in the 1760s did revive the idea and both claimed to be the American Philosophical Society, or its rightful heir. After a lot of infighting, they eventually formed a union, and we have the creation of the Philosophical Society. So shortly after this amalgamation or union took place was the 1769 transit of Venus on the afternoon of June 6, and it provided the ideal opportunity to rally around a scientific venture of global importance. Its members were well aware that the successful observation and production of accurate data could secure for the Americans the respect of the still skeptical Europeans. The successful efforts by the Philosophical Society, primarily at David Rittenhouse's farm outside Philadelphia, to observe and record the transit helped seal the position as America's premier knowledge association, with the scientifically inclined from across the colonies eagerly lining up for membership. In fact, American observations eventually proved to have been among the most accurate of any taken in the worldwide effort, and Neville Maskelyne, the King's Astronomer Royal, lauded the Americans, quote, "I thank you for the account of the Pennsylvania observations, which seem excellent and complete and do honor to the gentlemen who made them." And this is an image of the transit of Venus across the face of the sun. So Franklin and his many collaborators ushered in what I call a true knowledge revolution, as I said, one that preceded the political rebellion against the British and which upended the established economy of knowledge. Its ideas can later be found in the Declaration of Independence and in other founding documents of the Republic, and involve many of the same figures. So I'd like to conclude now with a brief reading from the end of the first chapter, which I've called The Age of Franklin. While the useful knowledge societies played no direct role in the revolutionary enterprise, they gave practical expression to the widespread ideas and attitudes that informed first the colonial rebellion and then the creation of a new nation and a new society. One need only glance at the interests, experience, and attitudes among the signatories of the Declaration of Independence and the founding fathers, such as Franklin, Jefferson, Benjamin Rush, Adams, Madison, Hamilton, and Charles Carroll among them, to recognize how deeply such notions went to the heart of the American Revolution. In a letter to Adams in 1816, Jefferson summed up the prevailing sentiments of the revolutionary generation. Quote, "We are destined to be a barrier against returns of ignorance and barbarism. Old Europe will have to lean on our shoulders and to hobble along our side under the monkish trammels of priests and kings as she can." Close quote. With the final political break with Great Britain, America was now free to shake off the inept meddling of priests and kings and to realize the implicit dream of a natural order, one of harmony and reason that had been perverted by an imperfect Europe. Now, of course, the immediate exigencies of nationhood that followed the successful Revolutionary War left the citizens of this new nation facing an uncertain future. Bereft of many of the institutions of old Europe, lacking capital and manpower, without great libraries or universities, and cut off from traditional markets by lingering British hostility and the threat of naval blockade, the new free and independent states had little recourse but self-reliance and practical study. Franklin's Society for Useful Knowledge and his many imitators, collaborators, and successors among the ingenious men of the former colonies pointed the way to an American future. Thank you.
And so now if you'd like to stay, we have time for questions and answers, if you'd like, Jonathan.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions. Also, I have some business cards here with links to my website if you want to see this or more information about this book or my other work.
In the 1980s, there was a journal established by some academics, I forget one in New Jersey, and some of my former professors at the University of Pittsburgh. I think it was called something like Knowledge Utilization.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know if you're acquainted with that whole sphere of thinking, but this kind of is an antecedent to that.
I'm not familiar with that example, but I'm not surprised because I think this really runs through the heart of American culture. I mean, we love our inventors and our tinkerers, and we lose patience with theoreticians and experts and academics. Those of you who are experts and academics know, be at the painful side sometimes. But I think as a popular culture, we would prefer Wright brother to theoretician of aeronautics. Yes, please.
The Indians and the slave populations at the time of the Revolution were supplying a lot of, or they had a lot of knowledge. What do you see as the interplay of the sort of upper stream of these revolutionary?
Limited, unfortunately.
Do they give credit along the way? Or
Not
are
really,
they
no.
not taking it, or what?
Well, Franklin was, I guess for the time we would say, was quite enlightened in some of his attitudes, though he went through a very dark period condemning the German immigration to Pennsylvania and was worried that Pennsylvania was becoming a German-speaking republic or something. But he later regretted that. And towards the end of his life, he became a leading, as did Benjamin Rush, another figure in the movement for useful knowledge, became leading figures in the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society. But interaction on any meaningful level, very limited. Though Franklin did spend some time with the American Indians and was really appalled at their treatment by some of his fellow Pennsylvanians. But I didn't see any evidence of anything meaningful. No. There were a few figures who tried to learn from Indian medicinal use of herbs and things, but limited, very limited, unfortunately. Yes, ma'am.
What library resources
Well, I owed a big debt, and I've mentioned it in the acknowledgments, to the scholars at Yale University who have collected and collated everything that Benjamin Franklin ever wrote. And so I can say that with very few exceptions, I have read everything that Benjamin Franklin ever wrote. A lot of it's online. The rest of it's mostly finished, and a lot of it's available here at the Library of Congress. That was very valuable. I also used the rare book room here and read some of the original pamphlets about all those pamphlets I mentioned. The currency pamphlet. Franklin wrote a very prescient analysis of American population trends. I've read descriptions of the parades and the labor parades that celebrated the creation of the federal Constitution. So the rare book room was also very, very useful. But without Yale, it would have taken many more years. Yes, sir.
I have two precise questions on the context of Franklin's activities, particularly related to the European links that you alluded to. My superficial and very ignorant understanding is that the U.S. owes a great deal to the Scottish Enlightenment, especially they're very much different than the influence from the French and the English. The Scottish really felt the humans were perfectible, not perfect, and that our system of checks and balances comes from the Scottish Enlightenment. Two questions. Is that the case? And if that's the case, how did it influence Franklin?
Well,
Clear?
I would have to commend you on much more than a superficial understanding. The Scottish Enlightenment was extremely important. The source that I found most convincing for the broad creation of a movement for useful knowledge was actually Francis Bacon, which significantly predates the Scottish Enlightenment. Of course, all of those figures, John Locke, David Hume, very, very important to the Americans. In the Library Company of Philadelphia's original catalog, there's a catalog of the first books that they had, and there's a note scribbled next to John Locke's Humane Understanding saying the most useful something book ever written or something like that. It was very, very important. But Bacon really drove the creation of the Royal Society. What did he do? Well, he argued that anyone, regardless of social standing, could make some meaningful contribution to the collection and observation of knowledge. He pushed the social organization of knowledge, not just this notion of the lone genius in his laboratory or in a university or on the top of a hill, but a collective experience a society had to get behind. So that was very, very important. So I would go back a little further and say Francis Bacon for sure, but I would then agree with you and say perhaps the Scottish reading of Bacon was extremely important. And one of the figures I didn't get to talk about, but he's profiled considerably in the book, is Benjamin Rush, who became the first Surgeon General of the U.S. Army, taught chemistry and medicine at University of Pennsylvania, did his advanced medical education in Scotland, and he later reported that it was in Scotland that he was sort of converted to the views of the Scottish Enlightenment and eventually to republicanism.
In the research, Madison went to Europe and did research prior to the preparation of the Constitution?
Yes.
Was he in Scotland?
Yes.
Did he spend much time there? What was that like? Do you know anything about that?
He apparently there was a system where you could buy tickets to medical lectures. I guess it was like a system of tuition, and so he attended medical lectures there, and then he would hop over to London and visit Franklin, who A, gave him money, and B, introduced him to some of his scientific friends in France. But Rush spent a considerable time in Scotland and came back a convinced Republican.
Madison.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you asked about
Just
Benjamin Rush.
Madison.
I don't know much about James Madison. I really tried to focus on the
Thank you.
precursor generation, if you will, to the Founding Fathers, because, again, I want to influence. If I leave you with one idea today, I want to make this argument again, that it was a knowledge revolution that enabled and preceded the political revolution. And I think that is, in fact, an area that this book is new.
It struck me as I was reading your book, which I enjoyed, that people who are most obsessed with useful knowledge today wouldn't be reading your book because they'd be doing useful knowledge. So, do you see your book as useful knowledge?
This is what you get when you invite a very intelligent friend to your book talk. Well, it had utility. I've lived a couple of years. I just recently bought a house in Portland, Oregon. I enjoyed my time at the Library of Congress. I mean, for me, writing is an experience that is very personal, and then it becomes social. So you spend your time in the library, you get this idea, you sell it to a publisher, that's a good part. You get a little money, you live off of it, and you work on it, and then you create this. And then there's always a point in the writing where I feel like, okay, I've already gotten everything out of this process that I'm ever going to get out of it. I've done all the research, I've conceived the project, I've probably written 90% of it. I really don't want to do the last 10%. And so I could have mope around the house for a while, and then something happens and I get it together. So there was a lot of personal utility. No, I don't. I think you're right. Anyone who's really interested in useful knowledge probably doesn't need to read this book, but I hope the rest of you will. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned how the University of Pennsylvania went off the track that Franklin had envisioned. How long after was it that universities of institutes of technology or polytechnics got involved, and were societies for useful knowledge involved in creating those companies?
Excellent question. When I've conceived this project, I thought I would kind of carry on much further into the 19th and possibly the 20th centuries, but I decided this really was a self-contained unit. Of course, if all of you buy books and other people do, maybe I'll do a sequel, but the land grant, I would identify the land grant laws, which were much later in the 19th century, as really, really important. And by then, these societies for useful knowledge had kind of given way to more specialized societies, engineering, medical, other technical, chemical society, and eventually the American Society of Advancement of Science type of institutions. And in fact, one point I didn't make, but I think is quite interesting, and I go into it in quite a lot of detail in the book, is the way in which the American notion of knowledge in this 18th century, early 19th century period was kind of a free-for-all. And so you had people taking the idea of electricity and trying all sorts of, medical therapies and predicting the future and weather forecasting at a time that Europe was really centralizing knowledge into institutions. And I think that also contributed to sort of overall American view of the power of ideas and the place of ideas in society. So while the Europeans were trying to sort of capture this knowledge and stick it in universities, in laboratories, and limit its scope to experts, the Americans carried on much, much longer in a populist orientation. And I think that was very important for 19th century technology and the way it grew out of, one guy who specialized in making farm carts started making railway apparatus. And then we have the growth of Paterson, New Jersey, which is the event I used to conclude the book, and how that became an federal industrial city. I mean, that city itself went through many transformations. It started out making cloth, and then it made paper, and then eventually it started producing trains, and then it made airplanes and silk, and it became known as Silk City. And so it had many lives, but a thread of practical technology runs through all of those activities. Yes, sir?
This sort of society of useful knowledge seems very American, and I'm just wondering whether once Benjamin Franklin became more renowned by Europeans, whether there was any cross-cultivation. Was there any kind of like, oh, maybe that might be an interesting way to look at things?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And Franklin and many of the other Americans who succeeded in this world were inducted into the Royal Society. Royal Society members were inducted into the various American societies. I didn't have a chance to mention it, but a very important aspect was the publication of a journal. It took the Americans a long time to kind of get it together, but a knowledge society would produce something called the Transactions or the Proceedings of them, and then they would ship it off to London, and the British would ship back theirs. And so there was an exchange of knowledge. And eventually these societies, as I said, broke down in the face of specialization. I think sometimes to their detriment. But of course we got other advantages from that. Yes, sir?
Two questions. First, about footnote. Did you find anything useful in it about the learning Arabic, etc.?
Well, you'll appreciate it. It was in Edward Said's Orientalism.
And second question, you mentioned Puritans, Quakers, and Baptists. Did religion play in a part of this?
I think religion did play. I mean, Franklin, one of the interesting things about working on Franklin is that there's a Franklin for everybody. Just for fun, and you can do it, go online to the great Library of Congress catalog and put in Franklin, and you'll get 1,000 hits, 1,000 titles. And there's Franklin the Diplomat, Franklin the Lover, Franklin the Chef, the first scientist, the first American. So there are lots of different Franklins. And there is actually a movement afoot today to co-opt Franklin into a kind of notion that America should be was a Christian republic and should always be. I don't see any evidence that Franklin would have had any time for this. He did believe in God. He was really quite a confirmed deist. But religion, in my view, played an important role because religious attitudes towards labor, of course, sectaries and other persecuted sects who came to America for various political as well as religious reasons would not have a lot of time for propping up the British elite, so that wasn't really a problem. But I think their attitude towards labor, that it was a positive thing to work with your hands, hard work was of value, was really, really important to this movement. But religion itself, I don't think, beyond that, setting that social. I'm going to give this gentleman a chance.
I wanted to ask you to talk a bit about the interaction of elites in this. Jefferson wasn't mentioned in your presentation until the last slide. And yet he was involved in a whole lot of engineering and scientific and agricultural experimentation. And the other question I had concerned these societies. To what extent do they function as elites to keep people out as opposed to spread knowledge? You talked about it having exclusive membership of a dozen and
That was, yeah, I should have made clear, that was just Franklin's junta. As they expanded, they became much more open. They certainly were, I mean, a lot of the figures who took active part in the creation of what became the University of Pennsylvania, in these libraries, were workmen, workers, laborers, craftsmen, petty merchants. So it was very much not an elite-driven. Jefferson, of course, in many ways is sort of sui generis, if you will. He is featured in the book. I felt that for the purposes of this talk, I'd like to talk about, introduce some people that would be less known and fascinating figures in their own right. Of course, Jefferson was a technologist. He's known to have preferred serving as president of the American Philosophical Society to having been president of the United States. Well, maybe we can understand that. And he turned one of the rooms of the White House into what was known as the bone room, where he put all the fossils. His teams collected fossils of dinosaurs collected from, and he used to apparently bore dinner guests all night who wanted to talk about politics or make some deal with the government. He just wanted to talk about his bones. So I think we're almost out of time. We have one more question or two more questions, and then if anybody wants, I'll stay afterwards. One more question, okay. Sir, you haven't had one.
The Iroquois Federation figured into the thoughts or into the later political constitutional thought. Who introduced that?
You know, I'm not sure, but I know Franklin was very knowledgeable about, he'd been dispatched to do a number of negotiations with Indian tribes, and he respected their culture in many ways, certainly in relative position to some of the others in the story that I'm telling. But Franklin, of course, was much more, eventually became much more radical. The Franklin version of the Constitution was what Pennsylvania had briefly during the Revolution and was eventually overturned. And Franklin wanted to limit terms for president. The president should be unpaid, could not repeat a term, wanted a unicameral legislation, none of this division, the Senate and House, which he thought was elitist. So Franklin really was sort of much more radical and egalitarian towards his later days than those who carried the day among the founding fathers. But I can't speak directly to that. I think with that, I have to conclude. I'll be happy to stick around. And if you'd like some business cards, they're here. You can also follow my blog on Franklin, useful.drfranklin.com. Thank you for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.